Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the August edition of the 45 in 45 Minutes, talks given by members of the 1745 Association on aspects of the rising of 1745 that have been overlooked or forgotten. Tonight's speaker, Paul O'Keefe, is author of Culloden, Battle and Aftermath, published earlier this year to general critical acclaim, which looks at, among other subjects, the way the Hanoverians celebrated their victory over the Jacobites. Nothing captures the spirit of an age more than its songs and music. The Jacobite spirit of 1745 is captured in songs composed both during the Rising itself and songs composed afterwards in retrospect, many of them have given new life by our own troubadour, Charlie Zam. But what about the Hanoverian side? Curiously, notwithstanding the fact that they were the victors, fewer of their songs and music have endured and are popular today. So tonight's talk, which will look at the high and low culture of music on the Hanoverian side, will shed light on a generally forgotten and neglected aspect of the Rising of 45. And who better to tell it than Paul O'Keefe, art historian, lecturer and writer, author of biographies of Wynne Lewis, Henry Gaudier-Bresker and Benjamin Robert Hayden. He's also written books on Waterloo, The Aftermath in 2014, Culloden, Battle and Aftermath published this year, and a forthcoming book on Trafalgar, The Aftermath. So it is my great pleasure to welcome to speak to us this evening on the subject of soundtrack to insurrection, high and low culture of the 45, Mr. Paul O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to take issue with Mike there about the Hanoverian tunes being somewhat neglected and unknown today. One notable exception: 4 days after news of Cope's defeat at Creston Pans arrived in London, what was to become the National Anthem was first performed. It was first performed at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, and the next night at the Theatre Royal in Covent Garden, and subsequently it would end every performance given at both theatres. The musical arrangement was by Thomas Arne, the composer of Rule Britannia, although the air has been attributed to Henry Purcell. It was first performed in September 1745. And we have a letter from Benjamin Victor to David Garrick, written from London on the 10th of October 1745, in which he says, "The stage at both houses is the most pious as well as the most loyal place in the three kingdoms. 20 men appear at the end of every play, and one, stepping forward from the rest with uplifted hands and eyes, begins singing the very words and music of an old anthem that was sung originally in the 1680s at St. James's Chapel to King James II, when the Prince of Orange was landed to deliver us all from popery and slavery, which, thank God, in his goodness, he is graciously pleased to spare us." So here was a case of cultural appropriation. A Jacobite song, a Jacobite air, reappropriated and stolen for the Hanoverian cause. And it was here, as you see, as it was first published in the Gentleman's Magazine of October 1745, a song for two voices. O Lord our God, arise, scatter his enemies and make them fall. Confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. On him our hopes we fix. O save us all. Over the following months, there were many variants. Most of these were published in the newspapers of the time. Everybody wanting to add a witty verse. The most famous of these variants is that which goes, O grant that Marshal Wade may by thy gracious aid victory bring. May he sedition hush and like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush, and the French king. Now, I was very disappointed in researching my book and researching this section. I was unable to find any contemporary reference whatsoever to this one verse. Now, I assume that it may have been sung in the streets and recorded in private journals, but it was never published in the popular press. And the earliest reference I've found to it, it was in the Gentleman's Magazine of October 1836, in a long article about the history of the National Anthem. And there it was described as an additional verse, though being of temporary application only, it was but short-lived. Temporary application only being about rebellion in Scotland. So, the National Anthem. During this period, there were lots of attempts to catch the popular mood and to raise morale, most notably by the Hanoverian composer George Frederick Handel. And coinciding with the siege and surrender of Carlisle to Jacobite forces between 13 and 15th of November 1745, he wrote, and it was first performed at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, a patriotic song called "Stand Round My Brave Boys," and it was described as a chorus song. And here's the interesting thing. It was music by George Frederick Handel to words by John Lockman, and it was written for the gentlemen volunteers that were raised by the merchants of the City of London. And as I say, it was given its first performance at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane on the 14th of November, 1745, actually during the occupation of Carlisle by Jacobite forces. And it was intended to raise morale, certainly raising morale of the gentlemen volunteers raised by the city merchants. It was greeted at the Theatre Royal with universal applause and repeated the following evening by particular desire. And the fourth verse gives us a hint of just what the City of London merchants hoped for from the militia they had raised. They hoped that this militia would help to crush the rebellion. "We'll rush on the foe," goes the song. "We'll rush on the foe and deal death in each blow, till conquest and honour crown all. Then," here's the commercial bit, "then commerce once more shall bring wealth to our shore, and plenty and peace bless the isle. The peasant shall quaff off his bowl with a laugh, and reap the sweet fruits of his toil." It actually finishes rather touchingly as the young shepherdess welcomes her soldier back from the war, and coy Phyllis shall burn at her soldier's return and bless the brave youth in her arms. So the gentlemen volunteers raised by the city merchants would have something to look forward to when they got home. Now, 10 days before General Hawley's government army was defeated at Falkirk, an Italian opera was given its first performance at the King's Theatre, Haymarket, on the 7th of January, 1746. It was called La Caduta dei Giganti, or La Ribellione Punita. Please pardon my Italian. Translating as The Downfall of the Giants, or Rebellion Punished. It was a little-known opera by Christoph Willibald Gluck, a setting of 5 arias and a duet by his librettist Francesco Venesci. And the plot, very briefly stated, is that the giants, having rebelled in order to dethrone Jupiter in the skies and deprive the other gods of their freedom, whilst the giants are piling mountain upon mountain, Jupiter darts thunder from Olympus and takes due vengeance on their daring attempt by burying them under the ruins of the mountains they had raised. And it doesn't take much imagination to see the relevance of this to a London audience praying that this unruly rebellion that's going to deprive everybody of their freedom and turn us all into papists should, as swiftly as possible, be crushed. Now, Joseph Addison, editor of The Spectator, one of Joseph Addison's hobby horses was the fact that what he could never understand was that London theatre goers were so enamoured of Italian opera, given in a language that nobody could understand. He wrote, "London theatre goers, like an audience of foreigners in their own country, choose to be entertained in a tongue which they do not understand." And we can be sure that the King's Theatre patrons were equally monolingual as Joseph Addison, and that they were none the wiser for the Italian arias and choruses that were being warbled from the stage. There was a libretto in parallel translation, the Italian version on one side, the English version on the other. And this was provided to patrons for £1. They could follow the action. And here's the point. The Italian translation doesn't have any reference to Scotland or to England at all. And if you look at the left-hand side of the translation, the Italian version, roughly translated, means there is no perfect pleasure, no grandeur, no honour without freedom. And there the opera finishes. But if they were looking and following the Italian on the English translation side of the page, they would have got what follows. "Hail liberty! Without thy charms, the brightest regions are unblessed. Oh, keep thine Albion from alarms, and lull her pangs to balmy rest." Now, 10 days after news of Hawley's defeat at Falkirk reached London, London was very much in need of a fillip a morale booster. And Handel had been preparing one for some time. This was first performed on the 14th of February 1746 at the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden. But it was given its dress rehearsal, if you like, about 10 days before. And most of the contemporary comments we have about this oratorio are from that first encounter with it by various writers. And a man called Charles Jennens described this as a triumph for a victory not yet gained. And if the Duke of Cumberland does not make haste, it may not be gained at the time of its first performance, which indeed it wasn't. It was called an occasional oratorio, by which I take it to mean that it was, it didn't really have any subject apart from just a morale booster. It wasn't an oratorio celebrating the victory of so-and-so. It was, according to one person who listened to the performance, the rehearsal, said it was the libretto is expressive of the rebels' flight and our pursuit of them. And there is absolutely no doubt where Handel's sympathies lie. He, after all, was a Hanoverian composer, a native of Hanover, as was the king. May God, from whom all mercies spring, bless the true church and save the king. And then it goes on, the sword that's drawn in virtue's cause to guard our country and its laws, friend, parent, children dear, to guide its edge we heaven invoke. Rebellion falls beneath the stroke, and joy succeeds the fear. Millions unborn shall bless the hand that gave deliverance to the land. So there you have the occasional oratorio by Handel. Incidentally, the whole idea of an oratorio in London at this time, Handel's oratorios, were extremely popular. These were not in Italian. Only Italian opera was in Italian. Oratorio was, technically speaking, not opera at all. It was unstaged. And therefore it was known as oratorio. And all Handel's oratorios, like the most famous being The Messiah, were written in English and performed in English. We'll see later on in the talk how later oratorios by Handel responded to this crisis, this insurrection. But the occasional oratorio ended with the words and music of Zadok the priest, composed by Handel for George II's coronation in 1727. Handel was a great user of his own stuff. If it had a good tune, as Zadok the priest obviously did, he used it again and again and again, and he would insert it into whatever suited him, wherever there was a gap. So the occasional oratorio finishes with the words, "Blessed are all they that fear the Lord. God save the King. Long live the King. May the King live forever. Hallelujah. Amen." Now, as my old dad used to say, from the sublime to the God-blimey, harlequin and tartan, where all familiar with usually anonymous portraits of Charles Edward Stuart in tight tartan costume. And they are usually called the Harlequin portraits. And these were used as popular prints, in this case, an actual oil painting called Harlequin Portrait of Charles Edward Stuart, with a landscape in the background. And the popular figure, dumb usually, well, if Harlequin doesn't speak, he just dances around, moves around, gets up to mischief, and bangs people over the head. And it comes as no surprise that a popular manifestation of this political and military crisis, this insurrection, became a harlequinade, a pantomime. And here we have it. It was called Harlequin Incendiary, or Columbine Cameron. Just for the sake of background, Harlequin traditionally in Commedia dell'arte is always in pursuit of the apple-cheeked Columbine. And this musical pantomime that was first performed at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane has the same plot, generally speaking, Harlequin pursuing Columbine. Its music was composed by Thomas Arne, again, composer of Rule Britannia. I've not been able to find the actual music that Arne produced for this pantomime. I just thought I'd try and give you some idea of the plot. It opens in Rome, and there's a conference in the first scene between the Pope and the devil. And the Pope wants the devil to send an agent provocateur to Scotland to bid faction and rebellion grow and spread contagious evil. The devil raises the Prince of Mischief, Harlequin. Or rather, the Prince of Mischief is a demon who goes into Scotland disguised as Harlequin. And Harlequin goes up to Scotland. He arrives in Edinburgh. First person he sees is his Columbine, who he pursues throughout the play. Columbine's surname is Cameron, and she is based on Jenny Cameron, the scandalous Jenny Cameron, who was supposed to be the Pretender's mistress. Columbine is a flighty piece, and she is constantly leading men on. She has 3 suitors, one of whom is a beau, a fashionable young man. The other is a miser, and the other is a Highlander. And Harlequin goes out of his way to scotch these 3 relationships by magic. He turns the beau into a swineherd in a pig pen. He turns the miser into a mewling baby at the breast. And the Highlander is invited to an assignation in a brothel, only for the brothel to burst into flames, and he gets drenched by a fire engine. All 3 of these are magical transformations which would have looked fabulous on the stage of the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane when it was first performed. The Pretender comes on, and Columbine immediately falls for him and goes off in his arms. At which point Harlequin, jealous, gets together the other three blighted suitors, gets them, for reasons of his own, to join the prince's cause. And then you have the climax of this rather trivial piece. Scene: an English palace. A party of Scotch, headed by the Pretender, rush in, sword in hand. The palace immediately changes into a prison where Harlequin leaves them and sinks back to hell. And then finally, the final scene, the allegorical figures of Britannia, fame and victory appear in a beautiful garden, accompanied by the entire company. And they sing, "To William's name the trump of fame her sprightly sounds shall raise, whilst all around the hills resound and echo tells his praise. With George our defender we ever will join, for the voice of the people's the true right divine. Through dangers to safety brave William shall guide, and our hearts, swords and fortunes be still on his side." And everybody had a wonderful time in the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Now, 16 days before the Battle of Culloden, a slightly more elevated entertainment was performed in a theatre in Clerkenwell, the New Wells Theatre. It was an allegorical masque called Britannia Rediviva, Britannia Revived, or Courage and Liberty. And it was first performed on the 31st of March, 1746, as I said, 16 days before the Battle of Culloden. And obviously the London public was in need of a morale booster. And it was described and advertised as a new entertainment of music. Now, if you look up Britannia Rediviva, you'll find it described as a long poem by John Dryden, written and published in 1688 in celebration of the birth of the Prince of Wales, later King James III and VIII. So here again, you have another example of cultural appropriation. A poem, long poem by Dryden, in celebration of the Stuart lineage, being used as a title for a masque, an allegorical masque about courage and liberty and about the suppression of rebellion by the Hanoverian regime. So this celebration of Hanoverian power culminated in a tableau presenting the genius of England enthroned and rebellion dragged in chains before her by the figure of courage. The figure of courage sung and performed by Mr. Brett. The figure of rebellion sung and performed by, well, sung by nobody really. It's a non-speaking role. All the figure of rebellion needs to do is to be dragged on the stage and thrown down in chains in front of the spirit of England. And liberty was sung by Miss Lincoln and the genius of England by Miss Vaux. And 16 days, so it was first performed 16 days before the battle, And it was so popular that it was still being performed at the New Wells Theatre 3 weeks later, when news of Cumberland's victory at Culloden reached London. And one of my favourite clippings I came across was from a London paper. It appeared that on the 29th of April, the production had gone through certain changes. And Mr. Brett, who sang Courage, was now dressed as the Duke of Cumberland. And when he first appears on stage to sing the role of Courage in this costume, the gentlemen of the pit in the pit are described as several hearty Britons pounded their walking canes on the seating in such a torrent of satisfaction as rendered the damage to the seating far from inconsiderable. And the proprietor of the theatre was forced to go into print, and thankfully, acknowledging the applause, hope that his patrons would not in future be so transported so as to prove of such detriment to his benches. So the news arrives in London to universal celebration. The theatres respond with spectacle. I've not been able to find out really how this spectacle was staged. I assume that it would have been some sort of coloured backdrop with a picture on a large scale showing the battle and lit with sound effects. Presumably it would have been a sort of sonnet lumiere. And each day after the news arrived, you look down the newspaper reports. Less than a week after news of the victory arrived, the proprietor of the New Wells in Goodman's Fields, we're told in one newspaper, has been at great expense in representing the battle near Culloden House and defeating the rebels, that it has given universal pleasure to all that have seen it. It attracted such a crowded audience that numbers were obliged to go away for want of places. Absolute sellout. Not to be outdone, the New Wells Theatre in Clerkenwell, the rival house, had a tableau even better. The exact view of the battle fought under the command of our glorious hero, the Duke of Cumberland, with the horse in pursuit of the rebels and the complete victory over them. The proprietor claimed such universal applause from crowded audiences, as everyone is pleased to say, it is done far beyond all other trifling attempts. No other theatre having a stage sufficient to show such a distance of the hills, the river Spey, and the number of horse and foot that must be engaged in the battle and in pursuit of the rebels. You really do get the impression of an 18th century version of Cinerama. Sadler's Wells opened their spectacle 5 days later, and the management defended this delay by saying that it was impossible to do justice to an affair of this consequence without sufficient deliberation, and hoping that every person of judgment will excuse its being a while deferred. Audiences were promised every particular incident corresponding with the latest intelligence of a furious battle presented and executed with the greatest vigour that a stage is capable of, and rival efforts in other theatres exhibited, dismissed as little irregular skirmishes by comparison. And now we come to Handel's oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, a sacred drama. Now, it has now been, it is generally thought of as being in celebration of the Duke of Cumberland's victory at Culloden. It was in fact first performed on the 1st of April, 1747, just a fortnight short of the first anniversary of the battle. And like many of Handel's oratorios at this time, and I'm thinking of oratorios like Deborah, Israel in Egypt, Samson and Joshua, all of these feature librettos based on Old Testament scriptural narratives about the Israelites' struggles against their various oppressors, be they Canaanite, Egyptian, Philistine in the case of Samson. And in this case, in the case of Judas Maccabeus, the battles against Sumerian and Syrian enemies. Now, all of these chronicles of Israelite struggle against oppression would have been interpreted at the time and were intended to be interpreted as a struggle against papal tyranny. By implication, God's chosen people are the British. Jehovah is a Protestant God and a staunch and all-powerful defender of King George II and the Hanoverian dynasty. And if one studies the libretto of Judas Maccabeus, we have clear references to what I take to be the carnage of Culloden. In Act 2, the victorious Jewish general is described as pursuing his enemies through hills of carnage and a sea of blood. The librettist was a Reverend Thomas Morrill, and he claimed that for this libretto, for Judas Maccabeus, he had introduced several incidents, even more apropos, into his text, but it was thought that they would make it too long. So we can only assume that his original intention was to insert far more references that would have been recognized by a London audience as referring to the suppression of the Jacobite insurrection. And they were, he explains it as being so as not to make the oratorio too long, but also it would have staled the piece for future revivals. So it makes it a little more timeless, not to have too specific reference to Culloden. The libretto was dedicated to the Duke of Cumberland, and on the title page, Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, this faint portraiture of the Jewish general, of a truly wise, valiant and virtuous commander, as to the possessor of the like noble qualities, is with most profound respect and veneration inscribed by His Royal Highness's most obedient and most devoted servant. Now, the piece of music, the chorus of Judas Maccabeus, that is most famous, that everybody thinks of when they think about Judas Maccabeus and is forever connected with the Duke of Cumberland, was not in fact included in the first performances. It was composed for the oratorio Joshua, first performed in March 1748. and it was not included in Judas Maccabeus until much later. And it would henceforward be the standard musical accompaniment to heroic achievement of every kind. In 1773, following General William Dalrymple's capture of the island of St. Vincent for the crown, someone suggested that whenever His Excellency is pleased to walk out, he ought to be preceded by post horns sounding out the tune of "See the Conquering Hero Comes." In 1775, it greeted General Thomas Gage's return to London following the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. It was played in February 1779 when a naval court-martial acquitted Admiral Augustus Keppel of misconduct and neglect of duty. It sounded in Admiral Rodney's ears as he was presented with the freedom of Huntingdon for beating the French at the Battle of the Saints in 1782. And it honoured Admiral Howe 12 years later after he beat them again in the engagement known as the Glorious 1st of June. Following his bare-knuckle match against Sam Martin in the summer of 1787, the prize fighter Dan Mendoza was brought in triumph all the way from Barnet to Leadenhall Street, attended by those who had witnessed the dreadful conflict with lighted torches and martial music, the principal voices resounding in full chorus, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." And it was an impromptu addition to the musical programme at Vauxhall Gardens on the night of the 21st of June, 1815, as the dispatch arrived in London bringing news of the victory at Waterloo. And it subsequently accompanied the Duke of Wellington's every public appearance for the rest of his days until I'm sure he was heartily sick of it. And throughout the 19th century, you will find it invariably was struck up by provincial brass bands across the country, praising victors of parliamentary by-election and sporting event alike. Now, I am aware that this talk, the soundtrack of Insurrection, might be deemed something of a misnomer, since we haven't yet had any music. But I'll finish with this.